In this segment on pay and productivity, let's take a look at the different types of compensation agreements that exist within most workplaces and think about the motivating factors of those agreements. First, let's separate these agreements into two categories: formal or express and informal or applied. Example of a formal labor agreement might be an actual written contract. It might be something stated in a supervisory manual. Or perhaps some employee guide. Or it might simply be part of the company's HR policies as they govern compensation for workers. So it's written, it's stated, it's documented, it's evident. And we know that both the worker and the employer have agreed to this contract. This is different, of course, from an informal contract or informal or implied employment agreement. An informal agreement may have the exact same components of a formal agreement, but it is not documented. It's likely verbal, and its only evidence might exist on pay stubs or paycheck copies. It's interesting to note, however, that an informal agreement and a formal agreement are equally as binding under the law. If I have offered you a job, as you've come to my company and interviewed, and I've offered you a job for $15 an hour, we shake hands, I say that I'll see you on Monday, you now begin to work throughout the week, and at the end of the week or the end of the pay period, I am obligated, I'm contractually obligated to give you that $15 per hour for those hours that you worked for me. And if it's been overtime in states or in environments where overtime is required, then there's some overtime premium that might have been applied to that as well. Notice that in this relationship, there is yet to be any document or evidence suggesting that this $15 an hour is actually contractually obligated to you. However, a written formal contract, documented contract, is simply another form of contract, and it is no more or less binding than an oral or verbal contract. It might be easier to stand up in a court of law because you have evidence of it, and it's no longer an issue of he said, she said, when you're arguing about these things, or no longer an issue of remembrance when you might be arguing about them. Rarely do those arguments take place, of course, but it's important to recall that a written agreement and a verbal agreement only differ in that the written agreement has a paper trail to it. It's something that's more easily evidenced. When we think about compensation arrangements and agreements, we have to think about who bears the risk in the employment process. And essentially, who bears the risk in this process is a function of what type of contract it is, what type of pay arrangement exists. And we'll talk in a few moments about the different types. But briefly, we know that if an employee is given a salary, a certain dollar amount per month, then the employer bears most of the risk in this relationship, because there's nothing to say that that employee is going to have the productivity that the employer expects. So these kinds of contracts, written or otherwise, that give a stated dollar amount for a meaningful period of time are ones in which the employer probably bears more risk in the relationship. However, when we have a piecework, say a pay for performance relationship, then it's exclusively the employee that bears the risk. The job either gets done and gets paid for, or it doesn't get done and it doesn't get paid for. These are fairly simple. These lead us to a consideration of what we think of as information asymmetry within the workplace and in the employment markets. It's sometimes said that the best sales job one will ever do is when they are selling themselves to an employer in an interview. They put their best foot forward, they dress the most nicely, they speak with the most perfect diction that they can, they are the most polite, most professional that they can possibly be. And similarly, perhaps the best sales job a company ever does is when it convinces someone to come and work for them. The reality is that the would-be employee knows exactly what kind of an employee they are. They know how they normally act, how they normally dress. Are they ambitious or are they slothful? Are they on time or are they perpetually late? Do they seek to always be respectful and cooperative, or do they seek to be loners, or do they seek to be somewhat combative and stir things up in the workplace? These things never come out in the employment interview. But the employee knows these things about themselves. They know where they've exaggerated on their resume. They know where they have pushed the bounds on anything that they've talked about. They know where they've overpromised and maybe setting themselves up to underdeliver. So the employer doesn't know these, but the employer might have some guesses or might have some signals, but they don't know these things. On the other hand, the employer knows everything about the working environment. The employer knows that the job that they're filling is vacant because the last employee left because the job was just that difficult. The employer is never going to state that in the employment interview, of course, but they know that that's the difficulty or the reality of the situation, or they know that the hours are long, or that the environment on the production floor is hot and sometimes humid, or they know they know that there might be some other employees that are difficult to work around. They know that there might be a supervisory relationship that is very much a taskmaster relationship. They know all of these things about the job that the employee probably doesn't know. So there's a definite information asymmetry in this relationship as it begins. This information asymmetry, as you might suppose, leads to inefficient transactions, where the wage that is offered and the job that is done are matched as closely as possible, but it's difficult to match those well when neither side has perfect information about the other. We find that this sharing of information and the formation of employment contracts is all about seeking to align the interests of the firm with those of the worker. If you think about it, firms put together compensation arrangements in order to get the most that they can out of their workers in a period of time and to have compensated them just well enough to give the most that they possibly can and stay on the job. If they compensate them less than that, then the employee either won't stay on the job or won't give their best. They compensate them more than that, then they're wasting some dollars that otherwise could have gone to marginal profit. Now, if you're the worker, you wouldn't think of those as wasted dollars, but if you're the firm and if you're responsible to shareholders and your responsibility is to create a return on investment or profits for those shareholders, then you would have to think about that extra pay possibly as being wasted resource unless it gave you some extra benefit that's not immediately recognized within the productivity of the worker. So the compensation arrangement is all about aligning the interests of the worker and the firm, seeing to it that the worker gets enough to do their very best, seeing to it that the firm gets their very best without having paid too much. Within this relationship, we introduce the role of supervisors. And supervisors in the workplace have a very particular role. Their job is to constantly act to see to it that the interests of the firm and the interests of the workers are being co-represented. They act as a bit of a middleman, if you will. They deliver the good and the bad news of the working environment between the worker and the firm ownership or executive management. They have the squeeze position, if you will. And one of the realities of the supervisory relationship is that most supervisors have a tremendous amount of upward pressure. Most supervisors have many more direct reports and people working underneath them than they have people they're reporting to. So the accumulated voices, the accumulated noise of those that are reporting to the supervisor very often makes it difficult to overcome the accumulated voices of those that the supervisor reports to. So the role of the supervisor is difficult in this relationship. But the role of the supervisor and the role of compensation plans generally is to simply align the interests of the firm with those of the worker, to see to it that even in the face of this information asymmetry, both groups, both parties to the transaction, are receiving what they need to get out of the transaction and maintain a productive, profitable relationship. Well, let's look briefly at a few of the different kinds of compensation arrangements that exist. And this may not be any surprise to you. We'll look at pay-for-performance plans. We'll think about hourly compensation. We'll think about salary. And we'll think about some of the pros and cons of these things. First of all, pay-for-performance. Pay-for-performance is otherwise sometimes thought about as you get to eat what you kill. So piecework, where you're being paid a certain dollar amount per piece of finished good, is a pay-for-performance, a piecework pay-for-performance compensation agreement or compensation plan. One of the problems with piecework is that unless there's a quality control, sometimes an employee, a worker, will put out all the necessary pieces, they'll churn out all the necessary pieces, but maybe the quality wasn't as strong as it needed to be. So sometimes a piecework as part of a pay-for-performance process needs to have some kind of quality control supervision built into it, or there needs to be some kind of adjustment made for units that don't meet that quality standard. The next area, and this is very familiar to most of us, is commission. A commission sales job is virtually an eat-what-you-kill job, where you only receive a wage or an income based upon those items that you sell, those items that you transact. If you're not productive, if your efforts don't bear fruit in the production and or sales process, then no commission is paid. The firm hasn't spent money, you haven't received anything as the worker. However, this is not acceptable to many employees, may not be acceptable to you. And so firms have created a bit of a hybrid between commission and hourly or salary, and that's a base plus a commission. So some modest base, enough to get the employee to continue to come, good days, bad days, etc., to meet some of their absolute base requirements, but then they know that the vast majority or the bulk of their compensation, the sweet spot of their compensation, if you will come as a byproduct of their actual performance and output. This is kind of a hybrid, and sometimes a base plus commission is the most efficient type of compensation arrangement. Not always, but very often. We sometimes have just profit-sharing relationships. This is very, very much the case when you're in small business and informal businesses. Think about farming. Think about when we used to have cattle drives, and the cowboys were paid at the end of the cattle drive not based upon the number of days that they were out on with the herd, not based upon the number of hours, not based upon the number of miles, but based upon some percentage of what the organizer was able to get when they sold those cattle at market. Think about maritime compensation in generations past. If you were a whaler 100 or more years ago, you didn't necessarily receive a certain dollar amount. You received a compensation or profit share as a percentage or a small portion of that which was collected at the end of the voyage. These are all different kinds of pay-for-performance packages or compensation arrangements, again, specifically designed to try to align the needs of the firm with the needs of the worker. Salary compensation arrangements are more common as we enter into management, executive positions, or administrative positions. When I say salary here, I'm talking about a certain number of dollars per month or a certain number of dollars per year, in which the employee gets a paycheck periodically based upon the policies of the company. Perhaps it's every month, perhaps it's every 2 weeks, which would be 26 times a year, or perhaps it's twice a month, which would be 24 times a year. The compensation they receive is the exact same dollar amount every time. It doesn't vary. It's very dependable. It's very reliable. And they know that if they put in 40 hours in that period, they're going to get their compensation. If they put in 45 hours a week, they're going to get their compensation. If they put in 36 hours a week, they're going to get their compensation. So a pure salary relationship has a tremendous amount of consistency, but unlike the pay for performance, it has shifted the burden of risk from the employee to the employer, whereas the pay for performance contracts tend to have the burden of risk on the back of the employee, not the employer. Hourly compensation is not much different. It just shortens the time frame in which the risk might be associated. And it's on an hour-by-hour basis. And this is the type of compensation plan that is most easily adjusted or most easily managed by the firm. If a firm needs to cut back in their wage expense for a period of time, it can simply tell their workers to go home early. If a firm needs to expand their productivity and is willing to expand their wage bill for that period, the firm can require workers to stay extra hours. And in some cases, that might include an overtime premium. In some cases, it might not. The time was in this country where most any worker that worked on a Saturday or a Sunday received time and a half. And or on a vacation day, such as Christmas or Memorial Day, etc., they received time and a half or maybe even double time. And if they worked more than 40 hours a week, they similarly received that time and a half. That's not necessarily the case in today's environment. Those kinds of rules are more likely associated state by state today, and they're more likely associated with thinking about this, accounting all of it against that state's minimum wage. So the pros and cons of these relationships have to do with where the risk is borne, the consistency of pay for the worker, the consistency of the wage bill for the firm, the manageability of the wage bill for the firm, and whether or not the compensation plan has most directly aligned the needs of the firm with the worker. It's very common for a firm to put a compensation plan into place and find after some period of time, whether that's weeks or months or possibly a year or more, that what the firm was trying to motivate within this particular compensation structure is not at all what they motivated. My son works for a company in the south end of the Salt Lake Valley that very recently changed from an hourly compensation program to a salary compensation program. And in this case, it's a salary plus overtime if the employee has to work more than 40 hours a week, which virtually never happens within that firm, but they have that policy available. It does not include decreases in the employee's pay if they miss 1 or 2 hours in a month, and it doesn't increase their pay if they miss 1 or 2 hours in a month. So it's a consistency for the employee, and its intent was to find a way to share some of the prosperity of the firm and to reflect some of the productivity of the workers positively for the employees. What they found very quickly was that employees that had been showing up early and maybe staying long, all of a sudden were showing up not quite as early, maybe staying not quite as long. They found that many of their employees who were showing great discipline in terms of when they would arrive and when they would leave, how long they would be there, how intense their work was while they were there, slacked off just a little bit. And in this case, the firm actually had anticipated this. They had built this into their models. They knew that they were prosperous enough, there was enough economic surplus that the overall productivity employees could absorb this kind of activity. The employees, though, some of them didn't realize this, and some of them thought, well, wait a minute, I'm getting paid the same exact amount for showing up on time every day, staying the whole day, as the person sitting next to me who's not working as readily, who's not showing up on time every day, and maybe doesn't work as intensively, maybe is leaving a little early. I'm getting the exact same dollar amount as that person. That's not fair. So the firm had to then rethink some of this and tighten up on some of their arrival, departure, work hour policies. Firms are always having to do this type of thing, just as employees are doing this type of thing. Employees are constantly evaluating, just as the firm is. Remember that employees are REM, just as firm owners are REM. And REM is rational, evaluating, manipulative, maximizer. And as we think about compensation arrangements, we have to think through the fact that both sides can evaluate, but these are most efficiently evaluated when we have perfect information. We have perfect symmetry of information in the workforce, which we virtually never do.